Recently, Wizards of the Coast updated the core rulebooks for a semi-new edition of Dungeons & Dragons. Those of you familiar with my channel will know of my years-long quest to study, investigate and pick apart the implications of D&D 5th edition's rules. To study how established magic and monsters might affect the civilizational potential of a world, in the hopes that I could create a world that felt like a logical conclusion of the system itself. I believe that a world's practical reality should adhere to the system that governs that world. For those of you who don't know me, that means I've spent many hours talking to the camera about how industrial revolutions, labour reforms, agricultural reforms might all be possible off of the back of some of D&D's most popular spells. Heck, we've even discussed the invention of computing using talking dolls. But regrettably, all of this rather silly work is now for nothing, because Wizards of the Coast, or Hasbro, who owns them, decided that the game needs a fresh new coat of paint. And so, this setting, based on the implications of 5th edition's rules, needed to change too. Today, I want to discuss edition changes and the effects that they can have on established settings, either killing the setting off or creating world-shattering events or retcons in the process. Because the most deadly blow any setting can suffer, in my opinion, is an edition change. Let's start with my own experience as a standpoint. In the setting that I've been working on, cantrips have played a large role in the infrastructure of this world. Road building teams, for example, featured fewer labourers than you might think, and a civic mage, at least in modern organised societies, whose job was essentially just to cast cantrips. They would use spells like Shape Water and Mould Earth to loosen and move Earth, with essentially the efficiency of an earth mover, to excavate new earthworks, create roadways, and build up fast fortifications in unstable areas. These civic mages were essentially the frontline military and civil engineers of the setting. In my mind, these sorts of mages casting these sorts of cantrips were absolutely necessary for any frontier-styled situation, which a lot of the monster-filled world of D&D is likely to be. Sadly, both Shape Water and Mould Earth were removed in D&D's 2024 offering, and this left the specific type of civic mage unable to exist, as the only replacement really for these two elemental cantrips was elementalism, which has its own strengths, but very different strengths. It can essentially result in the infinite creation of small cups of water, or the spontaneous generation of sand, which is a useful building material, but it's not exactly the ability to excavate huge chunks of earth, or in seconds. Fundamentally, the civic mage, as I had envisioned them, cannot really exist in this new version of D&D, which is a shame, because that's one potent civilizational force, accessible through simply magic initiate at one single feat, that is no longer available to me in my world building. Because, again, to clarify, my specific project was to stick as close to the letter of the rules of D&D as possible to create a world that fits that setting. But the new rules also fundamentally shift demographics. This new version of D&D superpowered humans by essentially giving all of them a free feat, not just as a variant option, which has been done in the past, but essentially all humans have a certain skill that they are inherently better at by virtue of being human. This means essentially that humans are the best playable species at learning magic and essentially learning anything else as well. This essentially makes humans a far, far more dangerous player in the history of the world, especially in its prehistory, which ruins the plans I had to have a human minority in the worldwide facts of the setting. Now, the only way reasonably to have humans as not a majority or not one of the most powerful species on a D&D based world is to have some sort of divine intervention keeping them down, or perhaps just world builder intervention placing the thumb on the scales. Furthermore, as discussed in last week's video, a brand new type of item released in this new edition is essentially single-handedly responsible for the new reasonable assumption that every single person in an organised society would have their own familiar, and also potentially a whole bunch of other useful spells accessible by a communal magic item that can be attuned to by anyone, whether they can cast magic or not. This is all to say that demographically, practically, and socially, any world-building project that seeks to use D&D's basic assumptions and the realities, the mechanical realities of its system as the foundation for the setting, needs to undergo seismic shifts to actually stay correct or relevant or reasonable. Not least to explain the seeming sudden absence of half-orcs and half-elves on a global scale. To be fair, I am not complaining. I'm not saying that I now have to do a whole bunch of extra work to make the setting that I was working on now compatible with a new edition. To be very clear, I could just stick with the 2014 5th edition and all of its subsequent books and just keep on keeping on, pretending that no new edition has been released in 2024. But as someone with an eye towards one day potentially sharing this setting commercially, this option would also tragically result in total commercial failure, which would not be ideal. After all, people crave novelty and they want to play the new stuff. The bigger concern I have, though, is the effect of this problem not just on little old me and my personal pet project, but on all of the worlds that rely on a system to govern their rules and to give them their intellectual property. Because in my view, there is not a single D&D setting that has successfully survived an edition change unscathed. And this is worrying for the continuity of those worlds and the continuity of the games that exist within them. So now we're going to look at 3 settings as an example that I'm personally quite familiar with, from obscure to the Forgotten Realms. And we're going to highlight exactly what edition changes have done to these settings, morphing them sometimes out of recognition. First, the Tippyverse. This might not be a recognisable name to many, but it is a style of campaign building that was popularised in 3rd edition and especially 3.5. And it tries something very similar to the project I just described in 5th edition. It takes the rules of the game to their logical mechanical conclusion as part of the world building, while assuming that the people of said world are constantly seeking progress and advancement. This advancement often comes from D&D's magic system, which results in the Points of Light campaign setting. It's a post-scarcity D&D world filled with isolated megacities, isolated by space, but not by mass teleportation, which is very much the lifeblood of the setting and trade therein. This is made possible by some of 3.5e's wonkier mechanics, which, when put in tandem, created some rather absurd results. One key feature were the trap creation rules, wherein a trap could be imbued with reasonably any spell from the game. The trap would have a trigger, and when that trigger was met, the spell would be cast, the trap would reset, and the spell could be cast using that trigger once more. In Tippyverse worlds, this essentially allows for Create Food and Water to be cast repeatedly, infinitely, with no cost. All you need is a pressure plate for someone to stand on, and you've solved nutrition and food scarcity generally. It's pretty powerful. This simple exploit of a mechanic, which was originally intended for base building and essentially having a fireball pressure plate built into your base, became a core component of this post-scarcity world. And then 3.5 stopped being supported by Wizards of the Coast, and 4th edition came out. 4e was stripped back, had less room for magical shenanigans, and had far, far fewer splat books, source books, and crafting rules than 3rd edition had. In short, this core mechanic we just discussed, the trap-based exploit from the point of light system that powered the whole world, didn't exist anymore in the switch over to 4th edition. And fans of the Tibiverse fled kind of en masse to Pathfinder to recapture the magic. The game's design intent had shifted, and balance was a key watchword, if not always watched carefully enough. So 3.5 is more ridiculous implication-based fan content, such as traps of infinite food and water, and kobolds ascended to godhood were essentially culled. But of course, if your setting relies on a system's rules to make it function, an edition change is going to cause it to fall apart, of course. Tippy, the Point of Light setting creator, and myself really should have seen this coming. But it doesn't just affect settings that try this strange approach to world building. We're going to look at Dark Sun next. This setting survived an edition change. Technically, it survived 2 of them. So how on earth could I argue that edition changes are therefore cataclysmic for all D&D settings? Well, people weren't happy with Dark Sun in 4th edition. They weren't happy with Dark Sun at the end of 2nd edition. And many people certainly weren't happy in 3rd edition when the entire setting came out across a few magazines over the course of a month. But why was everyone unhappy? 2nd edition Dark Sun was a gritty and very pulpy setting, filled with a whole bunch of darkness and mystery that often tied in very carefully with the Prism Pentad novels. It was filled with darker and more disturbing themes, and the published adventures tended to follow along with the meta plot, essentially the plot of the Prism Pentad series. The books were essentially canonised and involved, as were these adventures, in moving the world along to new stages. When the setting was eventually properly revived in 4th edition, the main complaint about 2nd edition Dark Sun was this meta plot. Essentially, all of the interesting things that were happening in the world were happening as a result of a collection of characters that you didn't get to play. So the designers of 4th edition Dark Sun simply moved the world's timeline needle back to a point before these books and the characters in them had done anything of note. So far, so good. You're not invalidating the setting, you're saying, maybe this is all to come, maybe the books will play out again, or maybe something else will happen in your world. It works. But with D&D, a new edition means a new chance for the designers to do something that they find new and exciting. And every 4th edition setting had to share some historically unusual features. Eladrin, Tieflings, Dragonborn, and the Dawn War. A vast inter-reality conflict between primordials and gods, which eventually results in the creation of the Abyss. It's a bit complicated. Suffice it to say, these changes hit Dark Sun like a truck. Suddenly, there's a Feywild. There's an entire species of creatures based on devils, despite these settings' key focus on just having elemental planes, and then planes of light and shadow with a couple of other special little spaces within them. Furthermore, a massive secret of 2nd edition's Dark Sun, at least a secret held by game masters and not necessarily by all players, was revealed to all the players of the 4th edition version straight away. For the characters especially, and also the players in Dark Sun worlds, to see an ancient Dracolich raising an army of dragonkin humanoids deep in the veins of the earth in the 2nd edition masterpiece, A City by the Silt Sea, would have been existentially terrifying, confusing, and immensely alien. The insistence on Dragonborn being a playable species in 4th edition's Dark Sun kind of ruins this mystery immediately, and also severely hampers the tone of the setting as a place where very, very few species survived. The Drey, the Dragonborn analogue in Dark Sun, are essentially the remnants of horrific experimentation by a mad, undead being of immense, immense power. They are sorcery manifest, not just the guy down the road. Despite it being 4th edition's most successful setting, the established lore of Dark Sun suffered significantly. over this edition change. And now the big one, the Forgotten Realms. And I might miss some stuff, I might be very overly simplifying some stuff, because we don't have all day. I'm going to run very quickly through many of the changes that happened between first edition Forgotten Realms and the 2024 redesign of 5.5e. Between first and second edition, things need to change, so the designers give us the time of troubles. All the gods are sent down to the material plane because they've been naughty to go and kill each other, essentially. Whole pantheons are killed off during this time of troubles. And this is done by the designers essentially to make the second edition cosmology work. Also, during this transition, all assassins were completely destroyed by Merkel, I believe, so that Bane could ascend to godhood. I think I've got that right. That was essentially just to justify the removal of the assassin class from the game. Between second and third edition, the designers tried a different strategy. They would just hand wave away all of the changes. The introduction of the sorcerer class, and later in 3.5 the warlock class, it was essentially, hey, don't worry about these. These guys have been here the whole time doing their thing. You just haven't heard about them yet. This was, suffice it to say, a tad confusing for the world building. Between 3rd edition and 4th edition, the infamous Spell Plague was introduced. Like with Dark Sun, there are now also needed on Forgotten Realms to be tieflings. As a normal-ish type of person to exist. But also the old planar system needed to go and be replaced with something that fit the new edition a bit better. So let's have a dramatic world-changing event happen that starts with the death of the goddess whose name begins with M, who's in charge of magic. For the 3rd time. Now that will put the world in a state of flux where we can do all of our lovely 4th edition things. Before beginning to transition from 4th edition to 5th edition, reversing this change, locking up all of the pantheons into a kind of neat order again. But essentially this all results in the second sundering, wherein an old dead evil god is brought back into the fold and everything shifts around again. Heck, even in the unearthed arcana of the newest edition of the game, things are still changing. The Purple Dragon Knights have turned from elite forces of a nation's army into knights who have mastery over purple dragons. Now I'm going to say something controversial. All of this chopping and changing comes from a good place. It's the exact same instinct that I have as a world builder, except writ large on a corporate stage. The intent, every single time, is to make the new thing that the new rules can do fit into the old world that everyone loves so much. We've seen a lot of different ways that this can play out in this video alone. From abandoning D&D altogether, moving over to Pathfinder, resetting a timeline, to pushing things forward through world-shattering meta-crisis after meta-crisis, to simply introducing new stuff and hoping nobody notices or questions why it hasn't been here in the whole time. But it strikes me that a setting built around a system, built for a system, for a game, should live or die by that system. That is reasonable. And this world of business, which worries about the life cycle of games and quarterly earnings reports, is antithetical to this solution. The unsavoury solution. The unsatisfying solution. Let the cool world die with the previous edition, or live with its fans, and move on. Because that's the only way to ensure that a world is going to be coherent with a game's mechanics, when those mechanics all change. It just so happens that in business, that strategy means that your customer base will dwindle and fragment, and will end up leaving you for the new thing sooner or later. I fear that business, especially corporate style business and world building, sustainably and engagingly and in a way that adheres to the rules that you set out with at the beginning, don't mix. And that in my view, is a shame. But on that slightly depressing note, I hope I've at least given you something to think about. Let's not have the comments become a forum of crapping on world builders or designers. Please, I am interested in hearing your thoughts. But let's spare the vitriol which surrounds so much of the internet. I know I've made a slightly inflammatory title, but hopefully my position has been very well clarified here. But with all that said, I've been Tom, otherwise known as the WOTC. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.